friends. Thank you so much for joining us here. We know others are trickling in, but we don't want to waste any time. We are here today for the exciting topic from avoiding to embracing Rav Kook and the future of Shmita. And we are here with a great educator who put out an important book very recently on this, the Sabbath of the land. Rabbi Yedidya Julian Sinclair is an economist, writer, and rabbi. He began his career as an economist advising the UK government, was vice president and senior economist at Energiya Global, an Israeli solar power developer, and today works as an independent consultant on development projects in Africa. Yedidya was Senior Rabbinic Advisor for Hazon, the largest faith-based environmental organization in the US, and Campus Rabbi at Cambridge University, where he also taught Jewish studies in the Divinity School. He holds degrees from Oxford and Harvard universities and lives with his family in Jerusalem. His book, The Sabbath of the Land, will be published by Maggid Books in February, or was published in February. Thank you, Rabbi Yedidya, for being here.
Thank you, Rabbi Shmuley, for that generous introduction. It's a real honor and delight to be with you and to be teaching for Valley Beit Midrash. I'm a great admirer of what you do. It's just amazing that you don't just walk the walk, but you talk the talk in such a powerful way as well. And it's an honor to be a part of your program. So thank you very much for inviting me. So I've been fascinated, not to say obsessed, by the subject of Shmita for many years. Now, I see Shmita as a profound Jewish source of amazing social, economic, and environmental values. And I think it's one of the most profound and resources that we have within Jewish tradition to create a more just and sustainable world. Having said that, it's a resource which we haven't fully figured out how to use yet, at least not in the modern period. And I wanted to bring out this book on Rav Kook because I think Rav Kook's Shabbat HaAretz, which I translate it and comment on, is the most important book for understanding why Shmita is the way it is today, but much more important, what Shmita could be and what it could become in the future. Let me start off by telling you a little story about how I really got engaged in Shmita. It was 2007. It was the eve of the Shmita year in Israel. And somehow, I don't remember how exactly, someone from NPR Radio New York called me up and wanted to interview me about the crazy goings on that are happening in Israel at that time about Shmita. So what was going on? It was, there was a controversy about Shmita as usual, and some rabbis were arguing with other rabbis, and some people were not eating other people's food and not respecting their hechshers. And it was a typical Jewish boigus, and it got out into the world, into the New York Times, and NPR called, and somebody got to me, and they wanted to know what was up. So yeah, I tried to explain that there's this commandment in the Bible and in the book of Leviticus, and not working the land, and only there was this great rabbi in the early 20th century called Rabbi Kook who figured out a way we could do Shmita today, but not everybody agreed with him, and so that's why people are fighting today. And what she really wanted to know about was why she thought it was very funny, actually, that we were buying a lot of people were buying most of their vegetables from Gaza from people who'd been shooting rockets at us shortly before. For some reason, she thought that was very amusing, and she wanted to understand why that was. And I kind of tried to explain, well, people don't want to eat things which are growing in the land of Israel. Anyway, obviously, I completely failed because to explain it in a way which made any sense to her at all. Because she ended up and said something like, well, Rabbi Sinclair, that sounds really crazy. Thanks very much for joining us. And put the phone down. And I can't tell you how embarrassed and humiliated I felt. I felt embarrassed and humiliated for myself that I'd obviously not done a good job of putting across the beautiful and powerful ideas of Shmita. But I say I felt embarrassed and humiliated for all of us, because because somehow the way that Shmita was being practiced in the world was not, let's not to put too fine a point on it, not a way which was inspiring admiration and respect and Kiddush Hashem amongst people who heard about it, my limitations notwithstanding. And I silently swore to myself the next time would be different, and somehow I would do my little bit to make sure that next time was different. And it turns out that just at that moment, more or less, it wasn't just me, but there were other people, rabbis, thinkers, educators, activists, who were also just reached the end of their tether in terms of the shenanigans, the rabbinical shenanigans that characterized Shemitah at the time, and also swore to themselves that it was going to be different and they'd do something to make it different. And the next time it really was different. In 2014-15, there was a plethora of grassroots initiatives to actually make the values of Shemitah real in Israeli social, environmental, and economic policy. And I'll come later on to some of the things that have happened. And this time we're in the middle of a Shemitah year, and it's different again. I mean, it's a different kind of different because we're coming out of COVID and all that craziness. But Shemitah is becoming real in a way that it wasn't before in Israel. And as I said in the title, we're moving from avoiding Shemitah to embracing Shemitah. And by the way, the last two Shemitah years, I've had the same call and the same interview with NPR both times. For some reason, I'm their go-to Shemitah person. And so 7 years ago and a few months ago, they called me up, and I'm very pleased to be able to tell them that actually it's different now. Actually, there are other things going on in Shemitah in Israel today, rather than rabbis arguing with each other and not eating each other's food. But what I want to talk about today is how both of these moves of the avoiding and the embracing and the opening up of the possibilities of Shemitah in the future were made possible by, above all, I believe, by Rabbi Kook, Rabbi Abraham Isaac Kook, who I'll talk a little bit more about him in the course of the next half an hour or so. And through the remarkable work he did in his book Shabbat Ha'aretz, which I've tried to get across in the version that I've produced. So, and first of all, briefly, what is Shemitah? So, Shemitah is the sabbatical year. Once every 7 years, a remarkable change happened in the Bible as far as what happened in the world of agriculture in the land of Israel. So I just want to go through with you briefly the three main biblical sources of which talk about Shemitah. Each of them we'll see brings out a different dimension of what Shemitah is. So the first one is from Parshat Mishpatim, the book of Exodus, chapter 23. It says as follows, and I'll read them mostly in English, but the first line I'll read in Hebrew because it didn't appear in the English. V'ger lo tilchatz v'atem yadatem et nefesh hager, ki gerem hayitzim beretz Mitzrayim. You shall not oppress the stranger, because you know the soul of the stranger, because you were strangers in the land of Egypt. Now, moving to the English, it then says, 6 years you shall sow your land, gather its yield, but in the 7th you shall let it rest and lie fallow. Let the needy among the people eat of it, and what they leave, let the wild beasts eat. You should do the same with your vineyards and your olive groves, and that's Shemitah, and then moves on to talk about Shabbat. 6 days you shall do your work. On the 7th day you shall cease from labor, in order that your ox and your ass may rest, and your bondsman and the stranger may be refreshed. So what's going on here? In the seventh year, anybody who owns a field or a vineyard has to open it up. Let anybody come into it, the Torah says, animals too, and anybody just eats of what's growing there. So this is remarkable. It's your field for 6 years, but in the 7th year, in fundamental ways, it's not your field anymore. Right? The Shemitah suspends some of the essential rights of private property. Right? You open your field up, everybody comes in, rich, poor, old, young, animals, people, then they all eat and they all meet in your field equally and on the same terms. I think it's very important that to note that this comes out immediately after the commandment not to oppress the ger, the stranger, because you were strangers in the land of Egypt. You probably know that this is an injunction that occurs, I think, 36 times in the Torah, not to oppress the stranger because you were strangers in the lands of Egypt. And so this juxtaposition locates the laws of Shemitah squarely in the Torah's concern for the poor, the marginalized, and the oppressed. That in the 7th year, you open up your fields so everybody, and especially those who don't have fields, can come and share with what you have. So that's very briefly the first source on Shemitah from Parashat Mishpatim. Second source on Shemitah comes from Parashat Bahar, next week's Parsha as it happens. And again in the English, this is what Parashat Bahar teaches us. The Lord spoke to Moses on Mount Sinai, speak to the Israelite people and say to them, when you enter the land that I assign to you, the land shall observe a Sabbath of the Lord. 6 days years you may sow your field, and 6 years you may prune your vineyard and gather in the yield. But in the 7th year, the land shall have a Sabbath of complete rest, the Sabbath of the Lord. You shall not prune, sow or prune, or your field or prune your vineyard. You shall not reap the aftergrowth of your harvest, or gather the grapes of your unpruned vines. It shall be a year of complete rest for the land. But you may eat whatever the land during its Sabbath will produce. You, your male and female slaves, the hired number bound laborers who live with you, and your cattle and your beasts in your land may eat of its yield. So what's this source teaching us from Bahar over and above what we learned in Parashat Mishpatim? I think the emphasis here is not so much on those who work the land as on the land itself. Several times in this passage, we learn the land shall rest. It's not just enough that you rest, but the land should rest. The land should be able to rest, renew, and restore itself in the Shemitah. It's in the Shemitah period. I think what this is teaching us is that the land, the earth, is not just a resource to be exploited by us. It's not just a thing to be mined and used and overused for our purposes, but the land is an entity and it's a being with its own needs, and you might say with its own rights. That it's not just an adjunct to our prosperity. It's not just a resource for us to use for our own benefit, but we have a duty to steward the land and let the land rest, renew, and restore itself in order that it should have the rest that it needs. That's, I would say, the emphasis of the second source, that the land also needs to rest. The third source from Parshat Re'eh in Devarim, Tetvav, talks about the remission of debts. And again, skipping to the English, this is what Parshat Re'eh teaches us. Every 7th year she will practice remission of debts. This shall be the nature of the remission. Your creditor shall remit the due that he claims from his fellow. He shall not dun. I think that's kind of an archaic English word, which means sort of aggressively try and collect your loan. You shall not dun his fellow or kinsman, for the remission proclaimed is of the Lord. So what's this teaching us? It's teaching us that every 7 years, we have to if we've lent money to somebody, we just have to let it go. Right? Remarkable, but this is what the Torah is teaching. You lend money, and the 1st, the 7th, the 6th, up to the 6th year, you can get your money, ask for your money back, and be repaid for it. But with the end of the 7th year, the Shemitah year, you just have to let it go. The word Shemitah itself means l'shamet, means to let go. So this movement of just opening up your hand, letting go of your grasp and your hold on what you thought of as yours, your money, and leave it. Now, to be sure, it's a good thing. It's the rabbis saw it as a praiseworthy thing. If the person to you lent money wants to to pay it back anyway, but he's under no obligation to do so. He absolutely does not have to, and you may not demand the money back. Finally, if we're skipping almost to the end of this passage, it's fascinating the way the Torah ends this. It says, "Beware lest you harbor the base thought. The 7th year, the year of remission, is approaching, so that you'll mean to your needy kinsman and give him nothing. He'll cry out to the Lord against you, and you'll incur guilt. Give to him readily and have no regrets when you do so, for in return the Lord your God will bless you in all your efforts and all your undertakings." The Torah is saying something remarkable. It's saying, I know what you're thinking. You're thinking, okay, so the 6th year comes along and some poor guy comes along and asks you to lend him money. And you're thinking, what, like, seriously? I'm going to lend him money when I know that the next year is going to come along, the Shmita year, I'm never going to see it again? I'm really going to do that? And the Torah says, yes, you're really going to do that. The Torah is saying, I know this is hard. I know this whole business of Shmita is really difficult. It challenges you. It challenges your greed. It challenges your possessiveness. It challenges your acquisitiveness. It challenges the sense that your possessions are inalienably your possessions. And yet you have to be challenged in that way. And even though it's hard, even though it goes against the grain, you have to be willing to let go of your loan and lend to the poor person anyway, even knowing that you may very well not get it back. And this actually, to the best of my knowledge, Shmita is the only mitzvah in the Torah about which the Torah does this. It says it enters into the mind and the thoughts of a person who's contemplating keeping this mitzvah and says, I know this is difficult for you, but you have to do it anyway. And in fact, the Torah does this about Shmita not once, but twice, not just here, but also in Parshat Bahar. In Parshat Bahar, it gets into the thoughts of the person who's thinking, well, how are we not going to plow the land? How are we not going to work the land in the Shmita? What are we going to eat? And the Torah says, I know you're thinking, what are you going to eat? But know that I will give my blessing to the land in the 6th year so that you'll have enough to eat for the 7th and 8th years. I just wanted to add this short passage from Parshat Bechukotai, the passage which is the Torah reading for the week after next, because Shmita is not something that we talk about very much. It's not really a big part of contemporary Judaism, despite the efforts of the people I was talking about and the activists who try to be. But in the Torah, it's incredibly important. It's really hard to overemphasize how important and how central Shmita was for the worldview of the Torah and the Tanakh as a whole. Right? In Parshat Bechukotai, in the passage of the Tochacha, the curses, the Torah says as follows, talking about your exile from the land, and then it says, then when you're in exile, shall the land make up for its Sabbath years throughout the time that it's desolate. And when you're in the land of your enemies, then the land shall rest and make up for its Sabbath years. Throughout the time it's desolate, it shall observe the rest that it did not observe in your Sabbath years while you were dwelling upon it. What the Torah is saying is that while the purpose of exile, one of them at least, is that is for the land to make up for all of the Sabbath years, all of the Shmita years, which you didn't keep properly when you were in the land. From which Chazal, the rabbis, take the very short but logical step of saying that it is because we ignored Shemitah and didn't keep it properly, that we were exiled. In Shabbat 31a, exile, the punishment for exile, for ignoring Shemitah is exile. And this theme is repeated throughout the Tanakh. Now, Jeremiah says you're going to be exiled because you haven't kept Shemitah. And when they come back from exile in the book of Nehemiah and they reseal the covenant, the Brit, Shemitah is one of the handful of mitzvot on which the Brit is rededicated and reconsecrated. So what I think we get from all these passages is the clear conviction that Shemitah is no fringe mitzvah. It's not peripheral to Judaism. It's absolutely central to the conditions, the terms and conditions under which the land of Israel is granted to the Jewish people. If you keep Shemitah, then good. If not, then the rabbi said you actually forfeit the conditions under which the land is granted to you. So that really invites us to try and understand what is so important, what is so fundamental, what are the values underlying this mitzvah and these mitzvot, and what really is it about? What would it mean to really and truly and fully fulfill the mitzvah of Shemitah? So to sum up what Shemitah is about according to the Bible, it's a suspension of the laws of private property. It's a holiday for the land. It's a remission on debt. It's a chance for debtors to have another chance and to be released from the shackles of debt which have entrapped them for 6 years, and to actually get to make a new start in their life. In short, it's really a complete upending of the economic system as we know it. It's a suspension of the laws of the free market and private property in many fundamental ways, and a challenge to the whole economic system. Given that, and given what we said about Shemitah being so difficult and so challenging, it's not hardly surprising that a lot of the history of Shemitah has been about, well, how do we actually do this in the real world? How do we negotiate these incredibly difficult and demanding set of mitzvot? And how do we actually make it real in terms of the exigencies of economic life? So there's a lot of history to tell there, but I want to actually skip 1800 years of it and take us forward to the beginning of the return of Jews to Eretz Israel, to the land of Israel, in the 1880s, because this is where the rubber meets the road in terms of, can we make Shemitah real in a renewed Jewish country? So it was really hard to do that. The initial agricultural pioneers in the 1880s that came and tried to make a living from agriculture. Most of them were religious Jews, and to be honest, they weren't great at farming. They suffered terribly from hunger and thirst and malaria and terrible rates of infant mortality. Many of them, you go to the cemeteries of those initial settlements in Zichron Yaakov and Merchavia and Yesod HaMala, and you see terrible things. You see families who lost 3, 5, 6, even 12 children. Really extraordinary self-sacrifice, and which these people went through. And then Shemitah came along. In the first Shemitah year after the return of the first Aliyah was 1888 to 1889. And these people were barely hanging on as it is. And they think, what? Really? We're going to stop work and not do anything in the Shemitah year? That's crazy. We'll starve, or we'll have to sell our land, or we'll have to go back to Russia, or we'll lose, God forbid, even more children. How are we going to do this? So they were really, really at a loss to know what to do, because they were traditional, they were religious, they wanted to keep Shemitah, and at the same time, it just seemed overwhelming and impossible to do that. So what happened? They appealed to the great rabbinical authorities in Europe for some help, for advice on what to do. And the answer that came back was, well, this is what you can do. You know how before Pesach, Jews can sell their chametz in a sort of temporary and fictitious way to non-Jews, so they don't have to bear the economic loss of destroying all their chametz. Well, you can do something like that with Shemitah. What you can do is you can, sort of on a temporary and fictitious kind of way, sell the land to non-Jews during the Shemitah year. And with that, you'll be able to continue to work your land. So they said, okay, and thanks very much. But the rabbi said, but just this once, because things are really hard for you. So they said, thanks very much. And that's what nearly all of them did. In fact, there was one farming settlement, Maskeret Batia, which didn't want to do that. And they actually somehow or other in that Shmita year, and ever since, kept Shmita properly. They actually stopped working. I don't know how they managed to do it, but they did it. They said, we've come back to the land of Israel to fulfill the commandments fully and properly, and that's what we're going to do. But everybody else took advantage of this, this legal fiction, which the rabbis enabled them to do. Then the next Shmita year came along, and things weren't really any better. So they said, okay, you can do this again, but just this once. And then the next Shmita year, and the same thing. And then the next Shmita year was 1909, 1910. And then the chief rabbi of Jaffa and the surrounding settlements was Rabbi Abraham Isaac Kook, like the hero of our story. And Rav Kook was different from a lot of the rabbis of his time in a number of ways, but in this way in particular is relevant for our story. And that is that he really, really loved the agricultural pioneers who were building the land of Israel at that time. Now, a lot of them by this point were not religious anymore. There'd been another wave of immigration called the Second Aliyah, mostly made up of secular socialist pioneers. And most of the great rabbis at the time looked at these people and said, these are heretics. They don't believe in God, and they don't keep Shabbat, and they don't eat kosher, a lot of them, and they're God denying and treif eating, and they're not, they're not my partners. Rav Kook took a very different view. He didn't ignore or overlook the fact that they were secular and often didn't believe in God and didn't keep Shabbat, but he looked beyond that. He looked deeper than that, and he saw their extraordinary self-sacrifice on behalf of for the Jewish people and the land of Israel, and he saw the remarkable work they were doing. And he said, "These are my partners. These are my brothers and my sisters. I'm with them. The work they're doing is holy work, and I want to help them do it." And because of that, Rav Kook wanted to help secure and renew Jewish settlement in the land of Israel in any way he could. And so he saw that the situation was still precarious for them, and they still needed a solution for the Shemitah year. And so he wrote this remarkable book, Shabbat Ha'aretz, which he wrote in just a week, 120-page halachic work. And what he did in that book was to make the argument for this selling of the land of Israel during the Shemitah year to enable people to continue working the land and to put that on a firm halachic footing, a firm legal footing. And it was really one of the most boldest, most courageous and creative pieces of halachic argumentation and reasoning certainly in modern Jewish history. Said it's 120 pages of halachic argument, but I'll try and summarize the essentials of what Rav Kook did there in 4 points. There are essentially four pillars to Rav Kook's argument. The first was, I'll do this quickly, and if there's any questions you'd like me to elaborate anything, then please do raise them in the question period. The first thing Rav Kook did was to argue that Shemitah in our time is of rabbinic force, midorabanan as it's called, and not of direct Torah authority, midoraita as it's called. And as a rabbinic law, it has less force and less authority, and therefore there's more room for flexibility. The second poor thing that Rav Kook did was to argue that non-Jewish ownership of the land actually does uproot its holiness from the point of view of the observance of Shemitah. So you might, if you think about it, it's not obvious that it would. You buy it, you buy the land, you buy it, sell the land. Maybe that does nothing to the inherent holiness of the holy status of the land of Israel, and therefore does nothing to shift the obligation to observe Shemitah. And so the second part of Rav Kook's argument was to say, actually, it does. Actually, it does uproot the holiness of the land of Israel from the point of view of the obligation to observe Shemitah. The third thing he did was to argue that you actually can sell land to non-Jews in the land of Israel, because there's a biblical prohibition in Devarim, chapter 7, Lo Techanem Ba, which the rabbis in Tractate of Avodah Zarah, page 20a, interpreted to mean that you actually cannot sell land to Jews in the land of Israel. And so many rabbis at the time argued that this whole business was a non-starter because of that. You can't do it, full stop. And Rav Kook argued against that on a number of grounds, and the most fundamental being that the non-Jews today in the land of Israel are not the kind of non-Jews who this applied to. This was about idol worship. This was about not giving idolaters a foothold in the land of Israel. And Rav Kook argued that certainly Muslims and also Christians today are not idol worshippers, and therefore this business simply does not apply to them. And incidentally, in parenthesis, the issue has come up in I think I'll leave it in parenthesis actually, and move on to the next point. Finally, he argued, his argument was about, well, do we even believe that legal fictions are legitimate in Jewish law? Because it was clear to everybody that this is kind of it's a dodge, it's a loophole, it's, everybody understood what's going on here. You're using a loophole to get around a biblical commandment, even if today it's a rabbinical commandment, so just to avoid having to keep Shemitah. And is this even legitimate? And so the final part of Rav Kook's argument was to say, yes, it is, and to cite this slew of precedents about how, the rabbis and the halakhic authorities do allow legal loopholes like this. But the whole thing is, what's the meta halachic value which justifies using loopholes? And for Rav Kook was absolutely clear that the value couldn't have been greater. For him, the most important things in the universe, literally, were at stake. That this was about the resettlement of the land of Israel. This was about the rebirth of a Jewish country, which Rav Kook eventually believed would develop over who knows how long a period of time into a messianic reality. And literally, it was of immense cosmic importance that the settlers should continue and be able to do their thing. And so for Rav Kook, the meta halachic arguments for actually allowing this loophole could not possibly have been greater. So that in a nutshell was what Rav Kook's argument for temporarily avoiding Shemitah. I don't think he imagined that temporarily would last for another 120 years, but in fact it did. And even today, this remains the way in which most, from a halachic perspective, in terms of agriculture, in terms of what we eat and we don't want to eat, the way most people observe, or perhaps more accurately, don't observe Shemitah in Israel today. But apart from making this argument about how we could avoid Shemitah, Rav Kook did something else, and something which might seem to be, and perhaps was, in direct contradiction to this argument. Because what Rav Kook introduced this book, Shabbat Ha'aretz, with this beautiful, lyrical and poetic introduction describing what Shemitah could be one day when we actually do it, when we actually embrace it. Now, if you think that Rav Kook wanted us to avoid it indefinitely, that could hardly be more mistaken. So I put in here two passages from Rav Kook's beautiful introduction to the land of Israel. So he says, In the first passage, now in 1909, the Shmita year has arrived, according to the reckoning that we have. Owing to the poor situation of our settlements in the land, we'll have to make do with the temporary expedient that was endorsed some time ago by the greatest authorities of the generation, who understood deeply the situation of the settlement in our Holy Land. They had a penetrating sense of what it could become in the future, and knew not to belittle its smallness, because they understood that plowing these first furrows in our land could be a gateway of hope for our people and portend the growth of salvation that came from the land. They realized that their historic obligation to smooth the path of the new settlements, and as not much as possible not to let the mitzvah that connected the land be obstacles. God doesn't make tyrannical and unreasonable demands of his creatures. The circumstances that allowed us to be lenient regarding mitzvah pertaining to the whole community when there's a likelihood of significant financial loss, when a temporary situations of acute need, are all compounded in this case to an extent unparalleled in the annals of legal questions that have arisen throughout our lengthy exile. So, Rav Kook's saying there, it's not great, it's not ideal that we have to use this loophole, but the arguments, I hope it's only temporary, and it's just in order that the Jewish settlement in the land can survive and gain a foothold, and the arguments for doing so are absolutely overwhelming. And then he goes on to describe what Shmita will one day be, when we no longer have to avoid it, when we're able to embrace it in all its fullness and all its beauty. And so this is just one paragraph from a many-page long paean that Rav Kook sings to what Shmita will one day be. It says, it'll be a year of peace and quiet, where there are no tyrants or taskmasters. He shall not oppress his fellow or kinsman, for the remission proclaimed is of the Lord. A year of equality and relaxation, in which the soul may expand towards the uprightness of God, who sustains all life with loving kindness. A year when there's no private property, no standing on one's rights, and a godly peace will pervade all that breathes. It shall be a year of complete rest for the land, but you may eat whatever the land will produce during its Sabbath. You, your male and female slaves, the hired and bond laborers who live with you and your cattle and the beasts on your land may eat all its yield. Pernickety claims to private property will not profane the holiness of the produce of the land during this year, and the urge to get rich, which is stimulated by trade, will be forgotten, as it says, for you to eat, but not for your trade. A spirit of generosity will rest on all. God will bless the fruit of the land for you to eat and not your loss. Human beings will return to a natural state of health, so that they will not need healing for sicknesses. So it's the most remarkable, almost unbelievable claim that Rav Kook makes, which mostly befall us when the balance of life is destroyed and our lives are distanced from the rhythms of nature. For you to eat, but not to make medicine, not to use as bandages. A Holy Spirit will be poured out upon all life. It will be a year of complete rest for the land, a Sabbath of the Lord. Now, Rav Kook's saying in that last part that our lives and our bodies, physically speaking, get out of balance by the 6 years of rushing and running and striving and working and overworking and exploiting that characterizes so much of our economic life. And that makes us sick, he's saying. And he actually suggests that taking a year to return to a sense of balance and equilibrium will actually restore a state of health. I find it personally both hard to take this absolutely literally, but also hard not to be impressed by Rav Kook's understanding that that health and inner equilibrium are, from a holistic point of view, absolutely fundamental to human physical health and well-being. This is just a fragment of Rav Kook's vision for the social, economic, and ecological renewal that could happen. He believed would happen when we embrace Shmita fully. And what I want to say is that Rav Kook did two contradictory things in Shabbat Ha'aretz. He said, on the one hand, this is how we can avoid Shmita for now, because many people need to. But on the other hand, this is how beautiful it'll be when we will embrace Shmita fully in the future. And you can see how that's a very unstable position to take. On the one hand, avoid. On the other hand, but it's going to be so great when we don't have to avoid it anymore. And what's one way I think a correct way of understanding what's actually happened in the last 15 years, where all these creative and ways of realizing the social justice values of Shmita have emerged, is that unstable equilibrium has broken down. That people have finally said, look, you tell us how great it's going to be. It's when we actually do Shmita, let's do it. Let's stop avoiding it, Rav Kook. Let's actually put into practice your introduction, which says how beautiful it'll be when we finally come to embrace Shmita. So what's been going on? Well, it's an amazing plethora of initiatives have been going on in Israel and also in America, in the United States, largely under the inspiration of Hazon, about how to actually make the values of Shmita real. So, for example, last time around, there was a successful initiative to actually remit the debts of several tens of thousands of seriously indebted Israeli families by remitting some of their debts and working with financial management NGOs to help people manage their finances better so that they could avoid getting in that situation in the future. And the banks and insurance companies and utility companies actually participated in that initiative. There's been initiatives to figure out, well, what does it mean to actually do Shmita in a high-tech based society? If only 2% of people work in agriculture and the main drive of the economy is high-tech, how do you actually put these values into practice in companies? So there are a lot of creative and really fascinating initiatives in that direction, some of which I was actually involved in when I worked in Energiya Global. Happy to go into that in the question and answer session. This time and last time, there's been just a beautiful project called Shabbat HaShmita by Rav Yosef Tzvi Rimon. And his insight was, well, if Shmita is really about giving up control about our land, because land was the fundamental source of our wealth. But if land is for most people not the fundamental source of our wealth, what is? And his answer was it's our time. Our time is what most people use in order to create wealth. And so an meaningful actualization of Shmita today is to give up some of your time, to volunteer and donate some of your time for free to other people. So you had doctors and lawyers and psychologists and therapists and architects and social workers, all kinds of people putting their time into a time bank, and anybody who needed could draw on it, and so on. And just a remarkable outpouring of creative ways of making these values real in some way. And it's still small, and it's still not it's not the way most people are thinking about and observing Shmita today, but it's something which I believe is gaining force and gaining momentum as every Shmita year that goes by. Now I want to finish just in a couple of minutes by trying to place Rav Kook's thinking about Shmita in a larger theological or eco-theological context. Because for Rav Kook, I believe, his thinking about Shmita was part of a much bigger picture. And the bigger picture had to do with the way Rav Kook understood ta'amei hamitzvot, the reasons for the mitzvot. So many Jewish thinkers have given reasons for mitzvot, most famously Maimonides, the Rambam. And Rav Kook had a lot of respect for Maimonides, but he also criticized him in this area too, on the following grounds. Rav Kook said many of Maimonides' reasons for the mitzvot had to do with the past, and the distant past at that. They had to do with idolatrous people and stuff they did. They had to do with things that happened in the temple. They had to do with things that happened a long time ago. And the problem with the past is that the more time goes on, the further and further away the past gets. And so reasons for mitzvot which are rooted in the past, inherently, Rav Kook, become less and less compelling and less relevant as time goes up. And so Rav Kook very relevantly and radically said, I believe that the meaning of so many mitzvot that we have is rooted in the future, not in the past, but in the future. That we are heading towards, he believed, a world of ultimately a messianic world of universal values, when we will understand that the ethics of the Torah are meant not just for the flourishing of the Jewish people, but also for the flourishing of the whole world. And Rav Kook believed that the mitzvot are like windows of light shining from that future world into our present and guiding us step by step towards that future. So very famously, Rav Kook understood the laws of kashrut in that light. Rav Kook believed in the future we're all going to be vegetarian, and we're going to return to that sense of embracing and of harmony between humans and all forms of life, and we're not going to take the life of animals for food anymore. Rav Kook himself was a vegetarian, except he ate a little bit of meat on Shabbat. He said the laws of kashrut are about training us and leading us towards that vegetarian future. And many people would say that we're now 100 years further on towards that future than Rav Kook was, and we can understand even clearer than he could all the environmental and the humanitarian and the animal rights arguments for being vegetarian today, and that future is all the more compelling to us now than it was 100 years ago. And Rav Kook understood Shmita in these same terms. He wrote his great essay about the reasons for the mitzvot exactly at the same time as he wrote Shabbat HaRetz. And if you compare these two texts, and this we can't do it now, but I'm just gonna say it, you'll see that for Rav Kook, Shmita and the related Jubilee in the future have universal significance. That Shmita is a year of, Rav Kook put it, merging of our consciousness with the earth's, and that we and the earth have both rest in the Shabbat, in the sabbatical year, and this is a kind of a merging of our consciousness and the earth's consciousness. That for Rav Kook believed that the Jubilee in the future will be something which is observed by all of humanity. And therefore, we see why it was so important for him that we find some way to still keep the laws of Shemitah, even in some limited sense, today, because he really believed that these laws are about teaching us, guiding us towards this universal ethical future in which these laws of Shemitah and the Jubilee turn out to have universal relevance for all of humanity and for all of living things as well. And so the future which Rav Kook envisaged for Shemitah is much bigger even than loan forgiveness programs, and it's bigger than the initiatives about Shemitah in high-tech. It's really about a vision of universal emancipation for all people and all of humanity. Something that I can't fully justify today, but since we're only together for a short period of time this evening, I just wanted to put it out there. And if you want to learn more, then I can recommend a good book about it. So I'll stop there, and I'm very happy to hear any questions, comments.
Okay, great. Thank you so much.
Hi, hello, Yedidya. It's Irene from Broughton Park. How are
you?
Hello,
how are you?
Right. Shmuley, would you mind telling Yedidya he's got to send me this book, because I'm doing a review, and I live in the UK, and I first met Yedidya at Cambridge when he was so kind when I had my own book launch on Ibn Ezra. That's another time. but I write for a website that gets millions of readers, including a lot of Christians and rabbis and people like that. And I really do want to review this book in time for the Queen's Jubilee, Yedidya, when the Prince of Wales has said we've all got to plant a tree. Now, apart from that, you perhaps don't know, but you know we had COP26 in Glasgow. So I borrowed an older version of your book from Nigel, Nigel's mother, who lives around the corner from me, another Bichette thing. And she got it back from me because she thought you were going to send me one. And I then told the former Archbishop of Canterbury, who was speaking all over Glasgow and to the United Nations head, I am not joking, at Cambridge, about what is special about Judaism for the Jubilee and for green issues, for ecology. And around this time, Hazon asked our group to partner. I don't know if you're aware. And I had to write a guest letter, right? So the upshot was, I didn't know all this. I just quoted Rashi on Bereshit about this, subject and the first fruits, quoted from your book, quoted also Hillel Prosbul as well. And to my amazement, at Glasgow Cathedral, don't forget it was being held in Glasgow, not a pro-Jewish place at all. He spent the whole time talking to the charity Christian Aid, which hates Jews, about basically what you said. And he said, this great scholar, I think he meant me. I didn't know who he was talking about. And it was all Rashi, stuff from your book. And then he went on to meet this Guterres, the United Nations Secretary General, at a sort of 5 or 6 person thing in Cambridge, where he had been, as you know, head of a college. And because he's very brilliant. And he said the Judaism has the answer through the Jubilee year. And because he told me afterwards, and I couldn't believe it. I could not believe that, meeting Yedidya again. Nigel, I don't know if you know Nigel from Hazon. He was the head of Hazon.
Can I just, I'm amazed by what you say, Irene, and very grateful for telling me. And I think that's just a remarkable instance of what Rav Kook believed, that that ultimately the Jubilee year would have universal resonance for
but even more, he's now looked at the two poems by Rav Kook. This is Rowan Williams, for a new poetry book on religion. It'll be mainly Christian. It's a Christian publisher, but he's asked me to recommend 10 Jewish poets. So I didn't do all the Holocaust stuff. There was perhaps one, 20th century, also Israeli ones, and also stuff on these issues. And he's done an amazing take on Rav Kook, right? Which I want to put in with the review of your book. So you did it without being overly messianic.
I will nag the publisher.
Just get them to send a signed copy, and the website will be thrilled. And I mean, I don't want to overdo it. I'm quite old now, but I really do think that what you have to say, because your translation skills are so brilliant, if you don't mind me saying so, because I'm a member of the Israel Translators Association, your translation skills are so wonderful from your previous version of the book that I really think it'll be read, and please get them to send it me. Sorry that I took so long.
Thank you so much, Irene. Thank you.
Hear from someone else. Thank you. Who else would like to jump in? Rav Yedidya, one question I have for you is, we state very often, as you did, that there's an environmental value to letting the land rest. But I don't actually understand the science behind that. Like, how valuable is it to the land to not be worked for a year? And what is that agricultural value? How does that work?
I'm not a big expert on this myself, but my understanding is that by letting the land not work for a year, we restore nitrogen content to the land and other nutrients, which are the nitrogen being provided by when in agriculture, in industrial agriculture, by artificial fertilizers, and organic and sustainable modes of farming are based on crop rotation, in which you don't plant the same thing in the same piece of land year after year after year, but you plant different things in the same land over a cycle of years, and also you let the land rest. So I'm not. I can't give a really convincing explanation of that, but I do think that there is good science behind it, and and many Jewish sustainable farmers have embraced Shmita as part of the craft and the toolkit of sustainable farming. I mean, I think that on a broader level, I mean, we've seen the environmental power of keeping a kind of Shmita in a remarkable way during the COVID period. And I think that the idea that you could actually close down the economy for a period of time, a few months or a year, was just unthinkable until we actually did it. And it was incredibly hard and incredibly painful, and not idyllic and wonderful at all. But it was an experience of what happens to the world when you just close off the motors of economic activity and what I think many people experienced was the extraordinary renewal of nature around us, that we stopped flying and we stopped driving for a number of months, and the sky became bluer and the bird song became louder and clearer, and animals, which all kinds of exotic wildlife ventured into city centers, and we just experienced in a remarkable way the connection between our frantic overactivity and pollution and the degradation of the natural world, and on the other hand, our ceasing our activity and the renewing and restoration of the natural world. Most people actually felt that, I think, with our own senses. And so beyond the environmental impact of actually ceasing to work the land for a year, I think we felt the broader environmental impact of dialing down our economic activity more broadly on our natural environments.
Okay, so Rav Yedidya, another question I have for you in our last minute is there's a bunch of competing values, that the value of supporting Arab workers, the value of supporting Jewish workers, the value of letting the land rest, the value of kind of like the just obedience to God, so to speak. Like, how do you decide which of these are kind of a top priority? And just like on the practical level, as folks know, if you're in Israel right now, you can buy nochri, you can buy Gentile stuff, you can buy otzer beitin, you can buy this heter mechira, you can buy mitzrayim. There's all these different ways you can buy where you're shopping with your values. Like, how do you choose one over the other in your view?
I'm going to give a kind of a cop-out answer, I'm afraid, Roshri, and I'm going to say, I'm not going to tell people how to prioritize. I think we're just at the beginning of reclaiming the values of Shmita, after a long time when they were sort of dormant and irrelevant, and there's a plethora of different ways of doing it, and I'm happy that anybody is struggling with Shmita and trying to embrace and make these values real in their lives and in our collective life again. And I don't want to dictate to anybody about how they do that. As I said, that's a cop-out value, but I really believe there's a lot of experimentation, there's a lot of trial and error, and there's a lot of new initiatives happening around this, and I'm happy to see 1,000 flowers bloom.
Amazing. Well, thanks so much, Rav Yedidya. We hope everyone will pick up this important book and enjoy that. Pam posted it twice up there, and we look forward to continuing to learn with you throughout the week. Have a great night in Israel and a great day in America and Canada.
Thanks so much, everybody. Really enjoy being with you.